They called it the Jug, a squat, hulking beast of an aircraft that looked more like a flying oil drum than a sleek fighter. And yet, by the end of World War II, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had destroyed more enemy aircraft than any other American fighter. Over 7,000 kills in the air, and tens of thousands of vehicles, trains, and tanks destroyed on the ground. But the real story of the Thunderbolt is not just in the numbers. It's in the shock of what it wasn't. At first glance, this was no beauty like the Mustang, no elegant predator like the Spitfire. To many pilots, climbing into a P-47 felt like strapping yourself into a brute machine designed less for finesse and more for survival. What made it so extraordinary was simple. It refused to die. Shot full of holes, wings shredded, engines flaming, the Jug somehow brought its pilots home again and again. German soldiers nicknamed it the Flying Tank. For the men who flew low over Europe, dodging flak and strafing convoys, it was the only thing keeping them alive. The Thunderbolt was ugly, it was heavy, it was mocked. But it became the single most feared workhorse of the skies. And the shocking reason behind its strange nickname reveals a story few truly know. By 1942, the world was burning. Nazi Germany had torn across Europe, from the beaches of France to the gates of Moscow. Hitler's Luftwaffe ruled the skies, hammering cities, supply lines, and armies with ruthless precision. The Allies knew that to break the Nazi war machine, they had to strike at its heart, the factories, oil fields, and railways deep inside occupied territory. But reaching those targets was no simple task. Bombers could fly the distance, but few came back alive. German fighters and endless walls of flak ripped entire squadrons to pieces. What the Allies needed was a shield in the sky, an escort fighter powerful enough to protect the bombers, yet rugged enough to survive the storm. The battlefield was vast. From the frozen wastes of Russia to the green fields of France, war raged across every horizon. In the West, the strategic prize was Germany itself. The industrial hubs of the Ruhr, the oil plants at Ploiești, the rail networks feeding the Eastern Front. Whoever controlled the skies over Europe controlled the outcome of the war. For the Germans, keeping their skies closed to American bombers was a matter of survival. For the Americans, finding a fighter that could hold its own and bring its pilot home was a matter of life or death. It was here, in this desperate contest, that the ungainly P-47 Thunderbolt entered the stage. At first, no one believed this heavy Jug could make a difference. But history would prove them wrong. The Thunderbolt story began long before its first combat mission. In the late 1930s, the U.S. Army Air Corps faced a chilling reality. While Germany poured resources into sleek, deadly fighters like the Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf 190, America's own aircraft were underpowered, underarmed, and dangerously outdated. Something had to change. Enter Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian-born immigrant engineer working for Republic Aviation. He was blunt with the generals. If you want to beat the Luftwaffe, you need size, weight, and power. His design would not be a nimble duelist. It would be a sledgehammer with wings. At its heart sat the monstrous Pratt and Whitney R-2800 double Wasp engine, a 2,000 horsepower beast so large that the plane's fuselage had to be built around it. The result was the heaviest single-engine fighter of the war. To many pilots in training, their first sight of the P-47 was almost comical. At 19,000 pounds fully loaded, it dwarfed everything else on the airfield. Ground crews joked it looked more like a milk jug than a fighter plane. The nickname stuck, Jug. Most assumed it was a backhanded insult, and some pilots doubted they would survive in such a clumsy giant. Yet commanders knew what was at stake. General Hap Arnold demanded fighters that could escort bombers deep into enemy territory. Training bases across the U.S. echoed with the roar of Thunderbolts, as rookie pilots struggled to master its brutal takeoff and heavy controls. It was not forgiving. Many crashed before even reaching combat readiness. But those who learned its quirks discovered something remarkable. Once airborne, the Jug was steady, reliable, and, thanks to its sheer bulk, almost indestructible. Still, there were miscalculations. Early intelligence suggested the Thunderbolt would have the range to escort bombers all the way into Germany. But once deployed to England in 1943, pilots discovered a cruel truth. The Jug simply drank too much fuel. At first, they could only follow the bombers part of the way, leaving the B-17s and B-24s to face swarms of German fighters alone over the heart of the Reich. Losses were staggering. As spring turned to summer, squadrons of the 8th Air Force prepared to unleash the Jug in earnest. At airfields across England, pilots checked their .50 caliber machine guns, mechanics tightened bolts and patched fuel tanks, commanders drilled maps into their men's minds. The mood was tense, part anticipation, part dread. Veterans of earlier missions knew what awaited. Black puffs of flak in the sky, silver bombers falling in flames, German fighters slicing through formations like sharks. For the young men climbing into their cockpits, silence fell before the engines started. A silence broken only by the thought, "Will I come back today?" And then, with a thunderous roar, the Jug's first missions began. The first combat sorties of the P-47 Thunderbolt came in April 1943, from rain-soaked airfields scattered across southern England. Pilots of the 4th and 56th Fighter Groups, many of them barely out of training, strapped into their bulky machines and climbed into the gray skies above the Channel. Their orders were simple: meet the bombers halfway, engage the Luftwaffe if they appeared, and learn how the Jug handled in real combat. But nothing in training had prepared them for the chaos of the European skies. The weather was brutal, cloud banks rising like walls and sudden storms swallowing entire formations. Pilots often lost sight of their wingmen, scattering before they even saw an enemy. And when the Germans came, they came fast. Sleek Messerschmitt 109s and deadly Focke-Wulf 190s dove like hawks out of the sun, their cannon fire shredding anything caught off guard. The Thunderbolt's bulk was both a curse and a blessing. Pilots discovered they could not turn with German fighters. Every attempt at a dogfight ended in disaster. More than once, rookies tried to chase a 190 through a twisting dive, only to see it vanish while their Jug struggled to follow. But when they fought on their own terms, diving from altitude or holding steady in a head-on pass, the story changed. The Jug's 8.50 caliber guns unleashed a storm of lead that could rip wings clean off in seconds. Still, victory came at a price. The Luftwaffe was experienced, disciplined, and cunning. They learned quickly to exploit the Jug's weaknesses, dragging them into turning fights or ambushing them as they climbed back across the Channel. On more than one mission, American pilots returned to base with bullet-riddled wings, empty seats where squadron mates should have been, and the bitter taste of failure in their mouths. Yet there were glimpses of hope. Stories spread of Jugs limping home with half their engines gone, landing with holes the size of fists punched through their fuselages. Mechanics shook their heads in disbelief. Pilots began to trust the machine, even love it. They knew it could take punishment no other aircraft could endure. By late 1943, the Jug was proving itself a fighter that could not be ignored. But beneath the victories, the losses kept mounting. Every briefing ended with fewer familiar faces in the room. And every mission carried them deeper into hostile skies where the Luftwaffe waited in greater numbers, armed with new tricks, deadlier ambushes, and an unshakable will to defend their homeland. The Jug had shown it could fight. But the true test, the nightmare that would define its legacy, was only just beginning. Dawn broke over occupied France. Low clouds hugged the fields, smoke from burning villages still hanging in the air. The Jug squadrons had their orders, not just escort strike. The time for half measures was over. Bombers would smash Germany's factories, and the P-47s would tear apart anything that moved on the ground. Engines roared like thunder as waves of Thunderbolts lifted off from muddy runways in England. Pilots gripped their controls tight, hearts pounding. The sky above the Channel was cold and empty, but they knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. Crossing into enemy airspace, the first sights appeared below: trains, convoys, columns of troops. The Jug dove. Its 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns opened up, spitting fire. The sound was deafening, a ripping metallic roar that drowned out everything else. Bullets shredded boxcars, fuel trucks exploded into fireballs, men scattered for cover. The smell of burning fuel and cordite filled the cockpit, acrid and unforgettable. But the Germans were waiting. Flak guns barked from the hedgerows. Black clouds burst all around the formations, metal shrapnel whistling through the air. One Jug vanished in a flash of orange. Another limped, trailing smoke, its pilot fighting to keep the wings level. Still they pressed on. Then came the fighters. Focke-Wulf 190s slashed through the sky, cannon shells thudding into American wings. The air was chaos, twisting trails of smoke, tracer rounds crisscrossing, pilots shouting clipped warnings over radios. A Jug tried to turn with a 190 and paid the price, spiraling down in flames. But the Thunderbolt had a weapon of its own: the dive. Pilots learned to point the Jug's nose down, throttle wide open, and let gravity do the work. The enemy followed and broke off in terror. At near supersonic speed, the Jug held together when others would tear apart. Climbing back into the fight, its machine guns barked again. One German fighter burst into flames, tumbling toward the ground. A small victory. Still, the cost was brutal. Pilots returned with bloodied faces from shrapnel, with wings peppered like sieves. Ground crews worked through the night, patching holes, loading fresh belts of ammunition, wiping dried blood from cockpits. Every mission blurred into the next. And yet, something was changing. The Thunderbolt's brutality was breaking the enemy. Railways in France collapsed under relentless attack. Columns of panzers burned on country roads. German soldiers began to fear the sound of a Jug overhead. Its roar meant death was seconds away. Even the Luftwaffe, once confident, was bleeding. Experienced aces fell, one by one, against the relentless tide of American fighters. For the men in the cockpits, survival was never guaranteed. They watched friends vanish in fire, their own fuel gauges dipping too low, their nerves stretched to breaking. But they also saw what their machine could do. Bring a pilot home with half a wing missing, carry the fight into the enemy's heart, and leave behind a trail of devastation no army could ignore. By the end of 1944, the truth was clear. The P-47 Thunderbolt was no joke, no lumbering failure. It was a weapon of pure destruction, a flying fortress in its own right. The Luftwaffe was cracking, and the Jug had become the hammer that would finish the job. By the winter of 1944, the skies over Europe looked very different. What had once been a battlefield dominated by German fighters was now scarred with wreckage, blackened trains, shattered convoys, and smoking airfields. The Jug had done its work with ruthless efficiency, but the cost was staggering. Hundreds of Thunderbolts never returned. Entire squadrons of young men were whittled down mission by mission, their bunks left empty, their names quietly scratched off rosters. In some units, only half of the original pilots survived their first year. The Luftwaffe suffered even worse. Its veteran aces, once untouchable, were cut down in dogfights or hunted from the sky by sheer weight of numbers. By late 1944, Germany was throwing barely trained boys into cockpits, desperate to stem the tide. The ground toll was catastrophic. Allied reports credited the Thunderbolt with destroying more than 80,000 enemy vehicles, thousands of locomotives, and countless bridges, depots, and artillery sites. For German soldiers, the very silhouette of the Jug overhead became a signal to scatter, to hide, to pray. Notable figures emerged from the chaos. Pilots like Francis Gaby Gabreski, who claimed 28 victories, became living legends. Others never made it home. Men remembered not by medals, but by the stories of comrades who swore the Jug carried them further than any other aircraft could. The immediate consequences were undeniable. With the Luftwaffe crippled and German supply lines shattered, Allied armies surged across France, through Belgium, and toward the heart of the Reich. The Thunderbolt had cleared the skies, crushed the roads, and paved the way for D-Day success and the relentless march to victory. The battle was over, but the legacy of the Jug had only just begun. History remembers the P-47 Thunderbolt not for its beauty, but for its strength. It was not the elegant duelist of the skies, but the workhorse that carried the war on its shoulders. Where others dazzled, the Jug endured. Where others fell, the Jug kept flying. Its impact stretched far beyond the battlefields of Europe. The Thunderbolt proved the value of survivability, of raw firepower, of fighters that could not only guard the bombers, but also devastate the ground war below. The lessons it taught shaped generations of aircraft to come. The idea that air superiority was not enough. True dominance required cutting supply lines, smashing infrastructure, and breaking the enemy's will to fight. For the men who flew it, the Jug was more than a machine. It was a guardian. Thousands came home only because their aircraft refused to give up when everything else had failed. To German soldiers on the ground, its shadow meant death was close. To Allied troops advancing across Europe, its roar overhead meant hope. Today, few Jugs remain. Most were scrapped, their metal melted down for peacetime industry. But the legend endures, in museums, in the memories of veterans, in the quiet respect of historians who know what it achieved. The Thunderbolt was mocked as ugly. It was heavy, awkward, and overlooked. But in the end, it proved a truth written in fire across the skies of Europe. Sometimes, survival itself is the greatest form of victory.